Hello and welcome to the second lecture for topic 1. In this lecture, we are going to focus on democracy and key features necessary for democracy. So what are we going to be looking at in this lecture? Well, the first thing we're going to look at is we are going to look at the key features needed for democracy. We're going to be looking at the importance of political knowledge. That is, that you need to have an informed citizenry as well as a citizenry that is active and participates. We're also going to be looking at the notion of that you believe that you can make a difference, that your voice and vote matter, that your voice is heard. That's a key feature of a democracy. And democracies respond to what the people want. And so we're going to be taking a look at each of these key features and asking ourselves, how's the United States doing in terms of possessing these features of democracy? Okay, well, just because you call yourself a democracy doesn't mean you are a democracy. Democracy, in other words, is more than just a name. And so here is a picture of the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And while most of us just refer to the country of North Korea as North Korea, it's known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You'll notice that they have keywords of democratic and republic and people in the name of its country. But just because it calls itself that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a democracy. And just take a look at the people that are posing with Kim Jong-un. For one, there is another military officer next to this family, assuring that each and every facial movement that these folks make are being recorded by the government. And the family looks like a combination of scared, maybe overjoyed to the point of tears, but basically sort of uncomfortable. So when you look at a photo like that, it doesn't scream out democracy, liberty, freedom. So in the previous lecture, we talked about generally what we mean when we say a democracy and some of the key features that we need in a democracy. So in the previous lecture, we talked about democracy being defined as rule of the people. And we talked about the idea that rule of the people generally means that political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. That is what is known as popular sovereignty. In other words, the people are sovereign. The people are ultimately the ones who authorize and give approval to the actions of the government. We also know that a democracy can come in different forms. You can have popular sovereignty, but having authority rest in the hands of the people can play itself out in different ways. So, for example, a democracy is a republic or can be a republic. So we know that the United States is a republic. That is, that it's a representative form of democracy, that the people select the representatives and that the representatives do most of the decision making. But a republic is a democracy because authority rests with the people that are electing people to do the decision making. We know that another form of democracy is direct democracy, where each person in that country or that state or that city is asked directly about how they would vote on a particular public policy matter, raise taxes, go to war, what have you. And that's a form of democracy. Some think about that as being a true democracy, but that's not the kind of democracy that we have in the United States. We also know that in order to be a democracy, you have to have popular sovereignty. You can be a republic or a direct democracy that still falls in the category of being democratic. But we also know that democracies are generally limited forms of government. In other words, that the government can't do whatever it wants to do, that it doesn't have total control over the people. The kind of control that a democracy has is outlined in a constitution, and generally democracies limit the types of power that a government can exercise, and that these are limited both in constitutional principles and also the laws that emanate from those constitutional principles. Democracies also have to protect the rights of the people from unwarranted and unjustified intrusions into their lives. And so democracies also have what are known as civil liberties and civil rights. So civil liberties are these basically these, you know, protections. I like to think about the Bill of Rights. That's where we find our civil liberties as the thou shall nots. It's basically telling what government what they can't do. It's saying that they can't establish a religion, they can't prevent us from speaking, they can't tell us who we must associate with, they can't search us without reason. And so democracies place clear limits on government, and in doing so, opens the space for people to live a relatively free and autonomous life. People's rights are also protected in a democracy in that they are not discriminated against, and that if the government engages in unjustified discrimination, there's a consequence for doing that. So from the previous lecture, we already have a pretty good idea of what a democracy is. It must embrace popular sovereignty. It can come in different forms, but it's also limited in terms of the power that it has. So there are other factors that a democracy needs in order for it to just not sort of satisfy the lower level criteria for being a democracy, but that there are other factors that allow a democracy to actually thrive and to create a truly democratic society. So let's take a look at what some of those additional factors are. One is that in a democracy, citizens have to be informed, and citizens have to actually participate in their government. You could call yourself a democracy, but if all the people who live in your democracy know nothing about the institutions and the procedures of government, if they don't know any of their rights that are outlined in the Constitution, and if they never actively participate in electing our representatives, well, you have to kind of wonder, is that truly a democracy? Another factor that a democracy needs is that people have to feel like their voice is being listened to. And this is what is known as political efficacy. Political efficacy, and we're going to go into this in more detail in a couple of moments. But political efficacy is just basically feeling like that you can make a difference. That if you do reach out to your representative with a letter or a phone call or a message, you feel like they listen to you and they actually feel like they are going to respond to what your concerns are. You also have to feel like when you vote that your vote is going to be counted and that your vote is going to make a difference, and that if enough people vote the way that you do, then you have to feel as if the policies that your vote represented are going to be enacted. And so the political efficacy is not, it's a belief that you make a difference and that your voice matters. And then finally, we're going to talk about that another factor that you need for your country to be truly democratic is that the government is responsive to what the people want, okay? So that if the people express something, for example, let's say people vote for a representative because the representative is pro-life, and the majority of the people in the district wanted that representative. But then when the representative gets to Congress, they don't follow through and they don't support pro-life legislation. In fact, maybe they support pro-choice legislation. But then when they're up for re-election the next year, maybe they get re-elected because they're an incumbent and they have a lot of name recognition or something like that. And so one would wonder whether or not that government is truly responsive to the will of the people given that kind of situation. So we're going to dig in a little bit more deeply and take a look at all of these three factors as it relates to creating a robust and vital democratic society. Okay, so let's look at political knowledge. So as I mentioned before, political knowledge is possessing information about the formal institutions of government, political actors, and political issues. In other words, political knowledge is the ability to maybe be able to identify and name who your representative is, the ability to identify key freedoms and liberties that you have, and maybe something as simple as being able to identify the three branches of government: Congress, the presidency, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And so political knowledge is actually having facts about the political world in which you live in. Now, keep in mind that political knowledge is more than just an opinion that you have about government or a strongly held viewpoint. A lot of people have a strong viewpoint about government, but just because you have a belief about government doesn't mean that that belief is actually based in fact. So political knowledge is actually knowing the facts about your government. It's not just having an opinion or strongly held belief about your government. Let me give you a concrete example of the difference between a political belief and a political fact. A lot of people in the United States believe, I teach a class on crime and justice, criminal justice. And a lot of people, when you look at public opinion polls, every year they ask people, is crime going up in the country compared from last year to this year? Is crime on the increase? Is it staying the same? Or is it decreasing? And people have a strongly held belief about crime in the United States. Year after year after year, people report that crime is increasing, okay? So when you ask that question, the vast majority of Americans say crime is getting worse and worse and worse. That's a political belief, but that is not the facts. In fact, crime has been on the decline, both property and violent crime, since the mid-1990s. And while we do have upticks here and there in terms of violent crime going up and down, the long trend in crime has been on the decline for quite some period of time. So that's kind of a good example of that. If you believe something to be true, but you don't really have the facts, that might lead a person to supporting policies or supporting politicians that, but supporting them and voting for them based on a misconception rather than based on facts. And so it's important in a democracy for the people who live in that democracy, wherein the power resides in their hands, for them to be informed. Because democracy is not just about people being active, but it's about people being active and engaging in an enlightened and informed and a fact-based manner. So how are we doing when it comes to facts about government? How are we doing in the United States when it comes to political knowledge? Well, we could probably do better. So this is a graph from your textbook, and this comes from the Annenberg Constitution Day Civics Survey that they do usually around in the summer and sometimes around when we have Constitution Day in the United States, which is around September. And they ask people in the United States fact-based questions about our government. And as you can see from the graph, there's some room to improve. Only at this time when this survey was taken, only 26% of people could identify all three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. Those are the three branches. And so the fact that most people in the United States don't, know that is maybe a little bit of cause for concern. I have to say that I have good news to report that when they did that survey in 2019, it went up to 39% of people being able to, or 39% of people unable to, or 39% of people were able to identify all three branches of government. So that's an improvement, but still that means that 60% of people are unable to identify the branches of government. I'll let you take a look at this, in terms of declaring war, being able to identify who's, running for as vice president. It could not name any of the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. 37%, kind of a shocking number. But when you look at our political knowledge, there's definitely room for improvement. This slide just shows you, as we're talking about political knowledge and the importance of having an informed and active citizenry, this graph just shows you the trends in terms of voter turnout in the United States. The purple line represents presidential elections, and the blue line represents midterm elections. And it shows you the trend from 1789 until 2018. For one, you'll see that there's a gap between midterm and presidential election turnouts, and we'll talk about why that is in future class periods. But it does show you that, about 60% of Americans vote in the presidential election in 2018, and it's hovered around mid-50s to low 60s for the last 3 or 4 presidential election cycles. And about 40% or so show up for the midterm elections, with the exception being these latest midterm elections, which were quite politically charged. And so on a good day, about, half to, 60% of people participate in elections. Just keep that in mind as we're asking the question about how we're doing in terms of being a thriving democracy. Another key feature of democratic society is the concept of political efficacy. As I mentioned earlier in the slides, political efficacy is the belief that you can influence what government does. The feeling that your voice matters, that government listens to you, that your concerns are their concerns. That's what political efficacy is. I want you to keep in mind that this is what citizens believe, not whether or not a person actually does something. And so political efficacy isn't that people's votes really do matter, or that government officials really do listen to the concerns of their citizens. Rather, political efficacy is a belief about whether you feel like your voice is heard, or whether or not political representatives listen to you. So it's really about this belief that people have. But the belief matters, because if you believe that nobody's listening to you, then the chances of you getting involved are a lot less. You might just sort of stop paying attention to politics or not get involved because you don't believe that you can influence things. Political efficacy in the United States is low. Most people in the United States don't feel like their vote or voice matters or is listened to. So let's take a look at a couple of slides that illustrate this point. So this slide is from a survey that the Pew Research Center did in 2015. And what this slide shows is the percentage of people who say that most elected officials lose touch quickly with people versus try hard to stay in touch with voters, don't care what people like me think, or cares what people like me think, puts their own interests first, or puts the interests of the country first. So all of those are questions that sort of tap into the sense of political efficacy. And as you can see from that graph, a very, very, very large percentage of people in the United States feel that their elected officials don't care about people like me, that they put their own interests first, and that they really are out of touch with their constituents. This is another graph that just shows change over time in terms of political efficacy. And so you can see that line on the top, the dark brown line, that there is a growing or an increased sense that most elected officials don't care what people like me think, from 64 to an increase of 10 points to 74 in 2015. And this final graph, also from the Pew Research Center, shows trends since the 1960s in trust in government. And it probably doesn't come as a surprise to most of you, particularly if you, as you read the chapter, they have a similar graph like this, that when you ask people, do they trust government to do, that they trust the government in Washington almost always or most of the time, that this is the percentage of people who say, yeah, they trust government to do what's right most of the time or always. And you can see that that's really decreased over time. From the 1960s, where nearly 80% of people in the United States had trust in government, to where we are today, which hovers around 20%. And it's been low, for a while. You can see that after 9/11, it plummets during George W. term, during Obama's term, and then Trump's term as well. So kind of a consistent low level of trust in government. And so lacking trust in government kind of goes hand in hand with this sense of low levels of efficacy. It also, it can be a cause for concern in terms of the health of our democracy. If people don't trust government to do the right thing, or they just don't really have trust and they feel like government is corrupt, then that is kind of concerning, particularly since people are supposed to have the power to make changes if they don't feel like the government is doing the right thing. Okay, the final factor or feature that we're going to take a look at is the idea that democracies should be responsive to what the people want, or the will of the people. Democracies are government of, for, and by the people. That means that government is itself the people, and what the people want should be reflected in the decisions that the government makes. This is, we talked earlier in a previous lecture about the concept of pluralism, and pluralism really is this concept that gets to what it means to live in a democratic society. In a democratic society, you have the right to speak freely. You have the right to assemble. You have the right to associate with other people who you agree with, that are like-minded. And what that results in is people binding together who share ideas, and they will express themselves in the marketplace of ideas by joining an interest group or joining a political party. And so pluralism is this belief, or a core principle, that all rights, all interests in a democratic society, they have a right to compete to influence government. And so they have the right to tell us what they believe in, to speak freely, and to publish that. We have a right to read that and then join their group if we find that their viewpoints are persuasive and align with our own interests. And then those groups can lobby and compete, or can try to influence government to sort of say, hey, adopt these policies. Or if you're a political party, trying to influence and persuade people to vote for your candidates. That's what pluralism is. It's the ability for interests to freely compete within the marketplace of ideas. But another part of pluralism, and this gets to sort of aspects of what you need for democracy, pluralism isn't that a group wins, has the most votes, or the group has, the most adherents, an interest group, and therefore they just then adopt a policy that sort of ignores the concern of those who are not in the majority, right? Who might be of a different interest group, but that doesn't have enough interest, doesn't have enough political power to elect a person or to influence the decisions of government. And so pluralism is about that competition, but pluralism is about also recognizing that the results or the outcome of that competition has to be compromise and moderation. So that when one candidate wins, that doesn't mean that they ignore the interests of the other political party members. They should strive to be and work somewhere in the moderate middle. That it's not my way or the highway, but that there's an understanding that as we compete, our interests compete, that there's compromise that needs to be struck because there are many groups that maybe didn't win the election, but that their interests are still important and should be taken into considerations when decisions are being made. Other aspects of responsive to the will of the people is an important aspect of democracy is the fundamental principle that every person gets one vote, and that no one person's vote is more or less important than the other. So in a democracy, we know what the will of the people is because each person gets one vote, and then whoever comes in the majority, whether that's an elected official or in a direct democracy where the people's voice has been heard and the majority rules, that's a key principle of living in a democracy. But as your textbook points out, that it's not just majority wins, majority rules without taking into consideration what those who are not in the majority want. That we have majority rule, but that we also know that the majority can act like a tyrant. In particular, when the majority is only 51 or 52% of a population, again, they shouldn't dictate to the other 49%. They should approach governance with an eye to compromise and moderation. And there are often times when those who don't end up in the majority that their rights will be protected. And so just because the majority wants something doesn't mean that what the majority wants will be enacted. If what the majority wants is unconstitutional or illegal, then the judiciary could step in and say, for example, let's say we took a vote, this wouldn't happen, I hope not, and the majority of people want to reinstate slavery, right? Majority rules, right? Well, the courts would step in and they would say that violates the principle of equal protection under the law and the 14th Amendment at the abolishment of slavery and the 13th Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. So when we think about the will of the people, that it is majority rule, but it's often with limits, with an eye to concern about the rights of those who are not in the majority. And then, free and fair elections so that the will of the people can actually be registered, and that the will of the people must be protected. We must know what the will is because we allow people to speak freely, to associate freely, and to publish what they believe in the press. Okay, so in conclusion, here are some critical thinking questions for you to think about as you're working your way through the chapter, and that also as you are preparing for the exam, questions like this will appear on it. So one thing to think about is, should we be concerned about the low levels of political knowledge and the relatively low voter turnout rates in the United States? Is it a cause for concern that so many people cannot answer what the three branches of government are and don't know any of the rights or very few rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights? Or is that just sort of a question of fact, in that, let's say you wanted to, contact your representative, you would just figure out what their address is, you would mail a letter to them. Like, we've got a lot of information at our fingertips through the internet. So maybe being asked in a poll is different than actually being able to figure it out. Something to think about. Also, when it comes to low turnout rates, you have the right to vote, but you also have the right to not vote. And so maybe some people who feel uninformed feel like that they should maybe not participate in the process because they feel like only those who are more informed should participate. Just something to think about. Is there a relationship between low knowledge and lack of trust or belief in government? In other words, the less you know about government, then the more likely it is to just conclude, though, they're just a bunch of corrupt people like looking out for themselves and their own self interest. One of the things we do find is that people who are active in politics, who vote regularly and pay attention, and also those who have a higher level of education and a higher amount of political knowledge, those people actually have a higher political levels of political efficacy and also higher trust and belief in government. And so, just something to consider. Another thing to consider is about how incumbents generally have a really high rate of reelection, even though there's a high level of distrust and dissatisfaction with our government. Oh, why is that? Is government truly responsible to the people if the same people are elected year after year? Is there something about the power of incumbency or the way that districts are gerrymandered? We'll talk about that later in the semester. That makes it easier for somebody to get reelected, even though, a substantial proportion of the people living in that district don't want that person reelected. And so that would call into question sort of whether or not, to what degree government is responsive to the will of the people. And then finally, in two of the last five presidential elections, that's 40%, and it could very well likely happen again in this election, in the 2020 election. The person who becomes president did not receive the most votes. As we know, Hillary Clinton received 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did. But as we know, Clinton's not the president, but Donald Trump is the president of the United States. If that were to happen again, that would mean that half of the elections, like 3 out of 6 presidential elections, half of those resulted in person becoming president who did not get to win the popular vote. What do you think about that? Does that severely undermine the democratic principle of one person, one vote? Or is it necessary in order to make sure that there's not this tyranny of the majority? All right, just some things to think about. Sorry about my barking puppy in the background. But thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.